It began with a sound, a deep, metallic growl that tore through the clouds. In that moment, the world below had no idea that history was changing above it. A machine built from panic, born from two nations that were never meant to collaborate. An American body, a British heart, and a fusion so perfect, it turned the tide of a world at war. They called it the Mustang. But it wasn't just a plane, it was a promise. A symbol of what happens when invention breaks the rules, when cooperation replaces pride. From the ashes of desperation came the greatest fighter ever to fly. And its story is wilder than anyone remembers. Subscribe, and step into the cockpit of history. The hangars were cold that morning in 1940, the air thick with metal dust and fatigue. Outside, England trembled beneath the echo of German engines. Across the Channel, entire cities vanished under clouds of smoke. Britain was fighting for its survival, and every second mattered. In London, the air raid sirens had become part of life's rhythm. People lived between the wail and the silence that followed. Pilots climbed into cockpits they might never return from. Mechanics slept beside machines they barely had time to finish. Somewhere amid that chaos, a question was asked, not by generals or politicians but by engineers. What if there was another way to build a fighter? Faster to make, easier to fix, cheaper to fly? The Royal Air Force needed help. Their Spitfires were magnificent but too few. The Hurricane was reliable but aging. Factories were exhausted. Britain turned its eyes across the Atlantic, to a country still officially at peace. The Americans had industry, they had manpower, and they had something even more valuable: distance from the flames. So in 1940, the British Purchasing Commission arrived in the United States with a list of impossible demands. They wanted a new fighter, not in years but in months. It had to be fast, durable, capable of long-range patrols, and it had to use an engine already in production. The request was, by any reasonable measure, absurd. But desperation often gives birth to miracles. At North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, the idea was met with a mix of ambition and disbelief. The company had never built a frontline fighter before. Its engineers were young, many barely out of school. Yet when the British asked if they could produce the Curtiss P-40 under license, North American's president, James H. Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold promise. He said, "We can do better." That single sentence changed everything. Within 117 days, his team designed, drafted, and began assembling a prototype unlike any other. It was sleek, low-slung, its wings thinner than anything the British had seen. The design placed the radiator under the fuselage in a clever Venturi duct that not only cooled the engine but added thrust, a discovery that would later prove revolutionary. The new plane was called the NA-73X. The British would later name it the Mustang. But genius is rarely born in a straight line. The Mustang's first flights were promising, yet limited. The aircraft was fast at low altitude but gasped for breath above 15,000 feet. The Allison V1710 engine, though reliable, lacked a supercharger capable of sustaining power in the thin, freezing air of high-altitude combat. The RAF soon discovered that their new American fighter was impressive only until it climbed too high, and in the European War, high was where life and death were decided. Still, there was something about the Mustang's frame that refused to be ignored. Its handling was superb, its range exceptional, its aerodynamics ahead of its time. Pilots loved how it flew, smooth, balanced, forgiving. Even the skeptics admitted it felt different. The question was no longer whether the Mustang had potential, but how to unlock it. Meanwhile, over Britain, the war was evolving faster than aircraft could keep up. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s ruled the skies. Every new Allied bomber sent into Europe was hunted relentlessly. The daylight raids that Churchill and Roosevelt demanded needed long-range escorts, planes that could fly from England to Germany and back, covering the bombers all the way. No existing fighter could manage that. Not the Spitfire, not the P-38, not the Thunderbolt. The Mustang, though, had range. Could go the distance. If only it could climb higher and fight harder. In late 1942, an idea began circulating quietly among British and American engineers. What if the Mustang's airframe was fitted with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same heart that powered the Spitfire? It was an audacious thought, almost heretical. Mixing British precision with American practicality wasn't exactly in the rulebook. But wars are not won by rulebooks. At a small airfield near Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, Rolls-Royce test engineers decided to take the risk. They pulled the Allison engine from a Mustang and replaced it with the latest Merlin 61, a two-stage, two-speed supercharged powerhouse designed for high-altitude performance. On paper it seemed too much engine for the airframe. In practice it was perfection. When the hybrid Mustang took off for the first time in October 1942, the difference was immediate. The climb rate doubled. The ceiling soared past 40,000 feet. The plane no longer choked in thin air, it devoured it. The once average American fighter had become something altogether new, a long-range predator with the heart of a Spitfire and the endurance of a bomber. It was fast, frighteningly fast. At 30,000 feet, it could outpace almost anything the Germans had. It could dive without tearing itself apart and turn with a grace that felt impossible for its size. The engineers who had doubted the experiment stood silent as the test pilot landed, removed his goggles and said simply, "You've done it." But this was only the beginning. The discovery soon reached the United States, where Packard, an American company licensed to build the Merlin under Rolls-Royce supervision, began mass-producing the engine for the U.S. Army Air Forces. The transformation from Allison to Merlin was not just an upgrade, it was a metamorphosis. The P-51B and P-51C models rolled off the lines in early 1943, and with them, the legend was born. Suddenly, the Allied strategy had a new axis. The 8th Air Force could now send its bombers deep into Germany, protected all the way by squadrons of Mustangs. Missions that once ended in massacre now returned with survivors. The Luftwaffe began to feel for the first time that the sky was no longer theirs. There is a strange poetry in how technology reshapes destiny. A design conceived in panic, refined in collaboration, perfected in defiance, all to serve a purpose far larger than the men who built it. The P-51 Mustang wasn't the product of one nation's genius, but of two nations' shared desperation. It was proof that innovation thrives not in comfort but in crisis. By 1944, the Mustang had become the guardian angel of the Allied bomber streams. Its pilots flew thousands of miles through flak and fire, their tanks nearly dry, their eyes bloodshot from hours behind the gun sight. They escorted B-17s and B-24s all the way to Berlin and back, striking at the heart of the Nazi war machine. It was said that when the Mustangs appeared, the bombers breathed again. The Germans knew it too. Luftwaffe pilots learned to fear the long silhouette with its broad wings and screaming dive. The P-51 could chase them from high above or strike from below. Could climb, dive, roll and still come out alive. Against it, even the feared Focke-Wulf 190 found itself cornered. In a war defined by steel and fire, the Mustang symbolized something rare: cooperation. The marriage of British design philosophy and American manufacturing strength produced an aircraft that neither side could have made alone. It was an alliance forged not by politics but by engineering. And yet, behind every machine there are people. The pilots who trusted their lives to the hybrid speed. The mechanics who tuned its engines in the cold dawn. The engineers who stayed awake for days calculating airflow and stress points. Most of them would never meet each other, yet together they created one of the finest weapons of the 20th century. But the story of the Mustang was not merely technical, it was human. Because in its roar you could hear more than machinery. You could hear defiance. You could hear the echo of a world fighting not just for territory but for survival. And perhaps that is why, when the first Mustangs flew over Berlin in 1944, people looked up not with fear but with hope. For the first time in years the Allies ruled the daylight. The tide had turned, not because of politics, not because of numbers, but because someone, somewhere, decided to break the rules. The P-51 Mustang was proof that innovation knows no borders. It began as a project of necessity and became a symbol of victory. And maybe that's the greatest irony of all, that what started as an emergency request from a desperate island would end up changing the course of a global war. Have you ever wondered how much of history depends on accidents? On coincidences that, at the moment, seem insignificant. A decision made in a meeting, a sketch on a napkin, a test flight on a foggy morning? The Mustang story is one of those rare moments when chance and courage align. If you're fascinated by stories like this, the hidden turning points that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe because what comes next will take you deeper into the skies of history. By the time the sun rose on 1944, the sky over Europe had changed color. It was no longer the dull, gray theater of German supremacy, it had become a canvas of contrails, where silver bombers and sleek escorts carved new geometry across the clouds. The roar of engines above the fields of France and Germany told a story that was both mechanical and human, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang as the guardian of the air. Daylight bombing had once been suicide. Before the Mustang, every deep raid into Germany was a gamble measured in bodies. Bomber crews knew the odds. They would watch their comrades fall from formation, engines aflame, their aircraft spiraling down into smoke and silence. The Luftwaffe was relentless, striking from altitude with deadly precision. The message had been clear: daylight belonged to the Reich. Then came the Mustang. At first, the Germans did not believe what they saw. American bombers were being escorted hundreds of miles past the point where fighters should have turned back. The P-51s appeared suddenly, out of the sun, out of the clouds, and vanished just as quickly, leaving behind burning Messerschmitts and stunned survivors. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. The transformation was not merely tactical, it was psychological. For the bomber crews, the sight of the long-winged Mustangs flying beside them meant hope. For the Germans, it meant the beginning of the end. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland later wrote that the Mustang was the best fighter of the war, a grudging respect that spoke volumes. Even the enemy could not deny what it represented. But the Mustang's triumph was built on more than technology. It was the product of relentless adaptation, a collaboration between nations and minds that refused to accept failure. Engineers on both sides of the Atlantic refined every inch of its body, from its laminar flow wings to its fuel system that could carry it across continents. The combination of the Packard-built Merlin and the Mustang's aerodynamic design created something close to perfection. It was as if the aircraft was not merely designed but destined. In a single year, the Mustang transformed the strategy of the entire Allied air campaign. Before its arrival, bombers were forced to attack targets within limited range: factories in France, shipyards along the coast, rail lines feeding the German front. But with the P-51's unprecedented endurance, the bombers could now strike deep into the heart of Germany, into Berlin, Leipzig, Munich. Every city that had once been untouchable was now within reach. By March 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first full-scale raid on Berlin with Mustang escort. It was more than a mission, it was a statement. The skies above the German capital erupted into chaos. Dozens of Luftwaffe fighters dove in, expecting the same helpless formations they had destroyed for years. Instead, they found Mustangs waiting, fast, agile, merciless. By the end of the day, the balance of air power had shifted irreversibly. Behind each mission was an unspoken truth: the Mustang was built on sacrifice. Its performance came at a cost: the long hours of engineers who lived inside their drafts, the sleepless mechanics who bled into the machines they maintained, and the pilots who learned, sometimes too late, what the aircraft could endure. The Mustang was a gift forged in exhaustion and loss. One of those pilots was Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a young man from California who would go on to become one of America's top aces. Anderson described the Mustang as a dream to fly, light on the stick, stable, fast. He said that when you pushed the throttle forward, you could feel the aircraft lean into the sky as if it wanted to go higher. It wasn't a machine, he said. It was a living thing. There was a strange bond between man and machine in those days. Pilots often gave their Mustangs names: Old Crow, Big Beautiful Doll, Lou 4. Each name was painted in bold colors on the polished nose, a personal mark of ownership on a weapon of war. They talked to their planes before missions, patted their fuselages, whispered promises of survival. And when one didn't come back, its absence was felt like the loss of a friend. The Mustang's long-range missions were brutal tests of endurance. Pilots spent up to 8 hours in the cockpit, locked in a metal shell vibrating with sound and heat. They flew through hail, flak, and tracers. The oxygen mask froze against their faces at high altitude. The sweat in their gloves turned to ice. Yet they stayed because the bomber stayed and the mission demanded it. They watched explosions ripple through the sky and kept formation, because turning back was not an option. In the summer of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the Mustang took on a new role. It became the sword and shield of Operation Overlord. Weeks before D-Day, Mustang squadrons swept over northern France, hunting enemy transport columns, cutting rail lines, and destroying communication centers. They cleared the skies of German reconnaissance planes and forced the Luftwaffe to fight on the ground. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Mustangs were above them, patrolling the air, striking at any enemy aircraft daring to rise. For the soldiers wading through the surf below, the sound of those engines was reassurance, the invisible protection of a machine that had been born from two nations' shared resolve. The Germans fought back fiercely. Their new jet fighters, the Me-262s, appeared late in the war as a desperate answer to the Mustang's dominance. But even they could not change the tide. The Me-262s were fast, yes, but they were few and they needed to take off and land on long vulnerable runways. The Mustangs waited for them there, strafing their bases, destroying them before they could even climb. It was a cruel irony, the future of flight cut down by the present. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. Its pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. Fuel was scarce. The once mighty air defense of Germany was collapsing. And the Mustangs were everywhere, over cities, over rivers, over the very fields where the war had begun. What had started as a desperate experiment, the mating of a British engine and an American airframe, had turned into one of the most decisive advantages of the entire conflict. Yet behind that triumph was an uncomfortable truth. The Mustang's success had been born from a kind of chaos. No committee could have planned it, no doctrine predicted it. It was a collision of necessity and imagination. The world's most powerful nations had set aside pride and tradition, just long enough to create something that neither could have achieved alone. Even the engineers who built it struggled to comprehend its legacy. Edgar Schmid, the Mustang's chief designer, once said that he didn't set out to build a legend. He simply wanted to build the best airplane possible within impossible deadlines. He never imagined that, decades later, historians would call it the most important fighter of the war. We were not thinking about glory, he said. We were thinking about survival. And survival in 1944 meant speed. It meant range. It meant dominance. The Mustang delivered all three and in doing so became more than a fighter plane. It became a symbol. To the men who flew it, it represented freedom. To the enemies who faced it, it represented inevitability. But even at the height of its power, the Mustang's story was far from over. Because what happened next would test the limits of both the machine and the men who flew it. As the Allied forces pushed into Germany and the war neared its bloody conclusion, the Mustang would face its most demanding missions yet, and in those missions reveal the cost of victory. In the cold skies above Europe, where the vapor trails crossed like scars, pilots began to understand something deeper. Every war creates its machines, perfect, ruthless, efficient. But behind each invention is the same question that echoes through every generation. What will we do with the power we create? The Mustang answered that question not with words but with endurance. It flew until the war was over, until the silence returned, until the world below began to rebuild. And even then, even when peace was declared, the Mustang did not disappear. It lingered like a ghost of the age that created it. If you've ever looked up at a clear sky and wondered what it took to own it, the courage, the compromise, the madness, stay with this story. Because the Mustang's greatest chapter was yet to come. Subscribe if you want to know how a single aircraft came to define not just a war, but the very idea of freedom in the air. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. Cities smoldered, nations trembled, and millions of soldiers began the long, uncertain journey home. But in the airfields scattered across Europe and the Pacific, rows of P-51 Mustangs still stood gleaming in the pale light of peace. Their engines were quiet, their wings streaked with soot and memory. They had survived the war that had created them, and now the question lingered, what would become of them in a world that no longer needed warplanes? For a moment, it seemed their time had passed. The jet age was dawning. New engines roared with a sound unlike anything the old pilots had ever heard. Speed was no longer measured in hundreds but in thousands. The air itself would soon be conquered again. To many, the Mustang was a relic of a fading era, a beautiful machine built for a kind of war the world swore it would never fight again. But history rarely keeps its promises. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the United States found itself facing a familiar dilemma. Jet aircraft like the F-80 Shooting Star were fast but fuel-hungry, and the rugged mountains of the Korean peninsula demanded range, endurance, and reliability. Suddenly, the old piston fighter that had once ruled Europe was called back from retirement. The Mustang returned to battle, wearing new insignia, carrying new weapons, fighting under new skies. Pilots who had grown up idolizing the legends of World War II found themselves flying the same machine, but in a different world. The Mustang, now designated the F-51, became a close air support aircraft, striking ground targets, defending outposts and escorting bombers once again. Its engine thundered through valleys and across rice fields, just as it had once echoed over the fields of France and Germany. The enemy was different, the terrain unfamiliar, but the spirit of the Mustang was unchanged. Veterans who flew it in Korea spoke of its resilience. It could take hits and keep flying, its sturdy frame absorbing punishment that would have torn lighter planes apart. It could climb out of ambushes, roll into dives and still return home on a single engine, smoking but alive. One pilot described it as a warrior past its time, old, scarred but unwilling to die. And perhaps that is what made the Mustang eternal. Because every generation and every conflict found something of itself in that plane: courage, defiance, endurance. Even as newer aircraft replaced it, the Mustang's legend refused to fade. It had become more than a tool of war, it was a monument to ingenuity and human will. By the 1950s, many Mustangs were sold or gifted to Allied nations. They flew for the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force and countless others. They patrolled the deserts of Israel, the jungles of Indonesia, and the mountains of South America. In every sky they entered, they carried the same reputation: graceful, reliable, and deadly when provoked. The hybrid born from crisis had become a global citizen. It was no longer an American or British icon, but something larger, the embodiment of collaboration, of what happens when necessity and imagination meet without borders. And in that sense, the P-51 was more than a fighter, it was a philosophy in metal. At home, the aircraft found a second life in peace. Civilian pilots, many of them former servicemen, began buying surplus Mustangs at government auctions. Some purchased them for nostalgia, others for competition. Air racing had become a new obsession in post-war America, a thrill where the line between sport and madness blurred. And nothing raced like a Mustang. Over the deserts of Nevada and the coasts of California, these machines once built for combat screamed through the air at low altitude, chasing victory once again, this time without bullets. The roar of the Merlin engine returned, not as a sound of war but as a song of freedom. Crowds gathered to see them, cameras flashing as they passed, silver ghosts of the past, still faster than almost anything alive. The years rolled on, but the image never faded. The long nose, the swept canopy, the tail cutting through the sky like an arrow. Children pointed at them. Veterans saluted. Historians wrote, pilots restored, museums preserved. And slowly the Mustang became something rare, a legend that lived. But legends are built not only on triumphs but on contradictions. For all its glory, the P-51 was born from desperation, from the same war that nearly destroyed civilization. Its beauty was a byproduct of chaos. Its sound, that glorious growl of the Merlin, once meant death. And yet, decades later, people would gather in peace to hear it again. That paradox defined the 20th century itself, the ability to find awe in the aftermath of horror. In documentaries, in books, in the whispered stories of aging pilots, the Mustang became the symbol of a time when invention was a matter of survival. The war had demanded speed, but what it produced was elegance. The Mustang's lines were mathematical perfection, not because someone sought beauty, but because beauty was the natural shape of function at its purest. It's strange how often that happens in history. When people stop chasing aesthetics and start chasing necessity, they sometimes stumble upon art. The P-51 was that kind of accident, a masterpiece built not to inspire but to endure. As the Cold War settled in, the Mustang's shadow lingered. The jet fighters that replaced it, the F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, owed something to its design principles: clean airflow, light structure, aerodynamic efficiency. Engineers who had worked on the Mustang moved on to shape the new generation of aircraft, carrying lessons learned from that hybrid miracle of 1942. In a way, every modern fighter traces a faint lineage back to it. And yet, even as technology advanced, pilots still spoke of the Mustang with reverence. Jet aircraft were faster, yes, but detached. They lacked the intimacy of propeller flight, the direct conversation between hand, throttle, and engine. In a Mustang, the pilot was part of the machine. The vibration of the fuselage, the smell of oil and fuel, the response of the stick, it was all immediate, alive. You didn't just fly it, one veteran said. You became it. There is something timeless in that idea, the merging of man and machine not as dominance but as partnership. The Mustang was never about automation or control. It demanded the pilot's full attention, full respect. If you mishandled it, it punished you. If you trusted it, it rewarded you with grace. As decades passed, air shows around the world became sanctuaries for the Mustang's spirit. The spectators who gathered beneath its wings were not just watching a plane. They were witnessing a piece of history still breathing. The Merlin engine's deep, rhythmic growl rolled across the fields like thunder, drawing eyes upward and hearts backward, to a time when flight meant both danger and deliverance. Every few years, fewer of them flew. Maintenance was costly, parts rarer, and the pilots who truly knew them were aging. But those who still kept the Mustangs alive did so with reverence. They called themselves caretakers, not owners. This plane, one restorer said, belongs to history, not to us. And that is perhaps the truest legacy of the P-51 Mustang. It never belonged to a single nation, a single army, or even a single purpose. It belonged to the shared imagination of those who built it, those who flew it, and those who refused to forget it. It was proof that when humanity unites under pressure, it can create something that outlives the conflict that forced it into existence. The Mustang was and remains a paradox, a machine of war that became an icon of peace. Its wings once carried destruction, now they carry memory. Its engine once roared across battlefields, now it echoes through museums and skies of celebration. And in that sound, that unmistakable hum, you can still hear the ghosts of 1940, the urgency of invention, the courage of men who flew into the unknown. Some say that every great machine tells a story. The Mustang's story tells us about ourselves, our flaws, our genius, our ability to build beauty from necessity and to find meaning in survival. It reminds us that progress is rarely pure. It comes with contradictions, collaboration born from war, artistry born from fear, peace born from exhaustion. And yet, from those contradictions, the world takes flight. The P-51 Mustang is not just a chapter in aviation history. It is a symbol of humanity's strange dual nature, our power to destroy and our equal power to create. And perhaps that is why, even now, when one passes overhead and you look up instinctively, you feel something deeper than admiration. You feel connection. To history. To courage. To the fragile, extraordinary moment when invention met need, and the sky itself changed forever. If this story moves you, if you've ever looked at an old photograph and wondered what it felt like to live through that age, subscribe and stay. Because what comes next is not just the end of a machine's story, but the reflection of everything it meant. There are moments in history when technology transcends its purpose. When metal, motion, and human will fuse into something greater than invention. The P-51 Mustang was one of those moments. It began as a machine of urgency and ended as a symbol of freedom. But even that description feels too small. Because the Mustang story is not only about flight, it's about what happens when cooperation replaces competition, when imagination dares to defy boundaries. Long after the war, when the dust had settled and the world turned its attention to rebuilding, the Mustang still soared. Veterans returned home to quiet lives, but the sound of that engine, that deep, resonant note of the Merlin, never left them. Some said they could hear it in their dreams, that it called them back to a time when life was reduced to moments of impossible clarity. Sky, throttle, horizon. The Mustang became the embodiment of that memory, the sound of courage. In airfields across America, restored Mustangs began to fly again, not in formation for war but for remembrance. They flew on Memorial Days, at reunions, at the funerals of old pilots. Each takeoff was a resurrection. The crowd would fall silent, and as the plane lifted from the runway, the past seemed to lift with it. For those who had lived through the war, it was more than nostalgia. It was a bridge between what was lost and what was learned. The Mustang had taught an entire generation that ingenuity could be moral, that cooperation could triumph where isolation failed. The marriage of the British Merlin and the American airframe was not simply engineering, it was philosophy made tangible. Two nations, divided by ocean and temperament, had come together to build something neither could have achieved alone. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson it left behind. That progress is not born of perfection but of partnership. That greatness does not emerge from certainty but from risk. When you trace the Mustang's lineage through time, you can see its reflection everywhere. In the cold precision of the F-86 Sabre, in the roar of the F-15 Eagle, even in the whispering stealth of the F-22 Raptor. Every generation of fighter that came after carried, in some small way, the DNA of the P-51, the balance of power and grace, the insistence that a machine can be both efficient and beautiful. But no jet ever captured hearts the way the Mustang did. Perhaps it's because it was the last fighter that still felt human, mechanical, tangible, alive. There was no computer, no automation, no digital mediator between man and motion. Every sound, every vibration, every ounce of force flowed directly through the pilot's hands. It demanded trust and it returned loyalty. A Mustang in flight was not a man controlling a machine, it was one organism, alive in the air. The pilot's pulse and the engine's rhythm became indistinguishable. They lived or died together. That kind of connection doesn't exist anymore. Today's aircraft fly by code and circuit, guided by satellites, buffered by algorithms. They are brilliant but they do not dream. The Mustang, though, it dreamed. And in that dream was everything we once believed about ourselves. That courage could overcome fear, that invention could outpace destruction, that the sky could be both weapon and sanctuary. In the decades that followed, as the last veterans aged and the last active Mustangs found homes in museums, their story became a kind of modern myth. People who had never seen the war still felt its echo when they looked at that silver fuselage, when they heard the name whispered in reverence. The P-51 Mustang. It sounded less like a designation and more like a legend. And legends have a way of reminding us who we are. Because the story of the Mustang isn't only about a plane. It's about the fragile, stubborn hope that humanity carries even in its darkest hours. It's about the idea that when people from different worlds combine their strengths, they can create something neither imagined possible. When the British engineers at Rolls-Royce agreed to share their Merlin engine with American designers, they weren't thinking about history books. They were thinking about survival. When North American Aviation's team stayed awake for days sketching designs on paper that smelled of ink and sweat, they weren't building a monument. They were racing against extinction. And yet, what they created outlived them all. The Mustang was proof that progress can rise from the ashes of chaos. It was born from the fear of defeat, yet it became a symbol of victory. It was designed for war, yet it taught peace. The peace that comes when nations learn to build together rather than destroy alone. It was a weapon, yes, but also a warning. That power, once unleashed, must serve purpose. Every generation has its own version of the Mustang. The moment when ingenuity meets necessity, when humanity proves itself capable of more than survival. But few stories capture it so vividly, so audibly, so beautifully as this one. Even today, when a restored P-51 streaks across the air at an airshow, something happens to those who watch. Heads tilt upward, eyes narrow against the sun, and for a second, time folds. The sound carries them backward, across decades, across continents, into a world where courage had wings. There is a hum at the edge of that sound, a subtle rhythm that feels almost human. Maybe it's imagination. Or maybe it's history breathing. The pilot inside that cockpit, wearing a helmet far too modern for the machine beneath him, probably feels what every pilot once felt: awe. Because no matter how many times it flies, the Mustang still feels miraculous. A perfect balance of danger and control, of design and emotion. It's not just flying through air, it's flying through memory. The world it came from is gone. The factories have fallen silent, the hangars turned to museums. But the spirit that built it, that restless, relentless belief that we can always make something better, that remains. And that is why the P-51 Mustang endures. Not because of what it did, but because of what it represents. The triumph of imagination over fear, collaboration over pride, creation over destruction. Some call it the greatest fighter of World War II. Others call it the machine that saved the bombers. But perhaps the truest name is simpler: the plane that proved what humanity could be when it worked together. And maybe that's why its story still matters now, in a world where divisions grow sharper and cooperation feels harder to find. The Mustang whispers a different truth, carried on the wind. That unity is not weakness, that blending ideas is strength, that borders are smaller than imagination. Look up and you might still see one. A single glint of metal in the blue, a sound that seems too alive to be mechanical. It banks slowly, sunlight catching its wings, turning them to silver fire. It's not just a plane. It's a memory of everything we once achieved, and everything we could achieve again. And when the sound fades, it leaves behind something rare. Silence, yes, but also understanding. Because to hear the Mustang is to hear the moment humanity learned to build with purpose. It's to hear the echo of collaboration, of courage, of the belief that even in our darkest times, we are capable of grace. So if this story moved you, if the image of that silver bird still lingers in your mind, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Ask yourself what the next Mustang might be, what hybrid of ideas, nations, and courage could again change the course of history. And if you want to keep flying through stories like this, through the forgotten skies of history, where invention met destiny, subscribe and stay with us. Because history never truly lands. It circles above us, waiting for those who still listen for the hum of its engines. The P-51 Mustang began as an accident. It ended as an anthem. And its song, the sound of two nations dreaming together, still echoes beyond time.